Today, I want to talk to you about why I don't typically recommend intermittent fasting to all my patients or clients. This is a very complex and nuanced topic, so I'm going to try and pack as much good information in about 8 to 10 minutes. But the bottom line is, we first need to define what intermittent fasting is. And so I'm talking about intermittent fasting from a very traditional perspective. Actually, we call it time restricted feeding, and that is typically when people are fasting for 16 hours of day, and then they're eating for 8 hours of that day, right? And the way that most people practice this is they skip breakfast, and then they usually have their first meal around like 12 or 1 p.m., and then they have an 8 hour eating window. So when I'm saying I do not typically recommend this style of eating for everybody, that's specifically what I'm talking about. There's a major amount of benefits to fasting in general, specific types of fasting, targeted fasting, periodic fasting. That's a whole other topic that I'll making a lot of different videos on. But specifically, I'm talking about 16-8 fasting, where people are skipping breakfast. And this is not a great idea for most people. And I first want to talk about the type of demographic of patient that I'm typically working with. So these are typically people between 25 of 30 years old all the way up to about 50, 55 years old. These are very busy people. They have a lot of time constraints. They have a lot of demands on their attention. They might have kids and families. So these are very high level people who are doing a lot of things. And so for them, it does make sense that they would try intermittent fasting 16-8, because it's just straightforward, right? You skip breakfast, your first meal is lunch, and then that's all you have to worry about. So the main takeaway there is it is very important to have some sort of constraints on your eating, meaning it's definitely a step up from traditional American eating habits, which pretty much from the moment you wake up to the moment you sleep, that's your eating window. That is not a good idea. But I'm going to tell you specifically about a lot of strategies that work a lot better. And I know this from experience. I've worked with over 1,000 patients. I have to implement these strategies in real life with actual people, and from a personal level as well. So that's the information I'm going to give to you. And so let's just kind of strip away all the different details. And at the very core, the fundamental positive of intermittent fasting, the 16-8 style, is that there is a constrained eating window. And what we see at an epidemiological level is that an ideal eating window is actually around 11 to 10 hours. The healthiest people on this planet, centenarians, that's typically their eating window. So in general, that seems to be great if you're able to do that. When you're pushing it, 8 hours and smaller of an eating window, then there's some negative consequences that come from that. For some people, they're more significant than others, but it increases risk of gallstone formation, for instance. And then another thing is, at an epidemiological level, what we see is that people who actually consume breakfast have better health outcomes. So they live longer, they're healthier, and they're able to better, more easily maintain a healthy body weight. These are tracked people. Now, obviously, there's, that's data that might have a lot of confounding variables, even though a lot of those variables have been accounted for. But that's what the general data tells us. But at an individual level, there might be more variation. But that is a good starting point. So we do see better health outcomes for people who prioritize a breakfast. That being said, another way to think about this is our energy levels change throughout the day, meaning we typically have more energy, more power, willpower, more discipline earlier in the day as opposed to later in the day. Our circadian biology changes throughout the day. So what happens when people typically miss breakfast or skip breakfast is they they usually make worse decisions around food later in the day. And that is not a good thing when you're eating poorly later in the day. Our body has a finely tuned circadian cycle when it releases hormones at different times. And all of these things affect weight loss and weight regain. And people who overconsume calories later in the day, and this is actually testing two groups of people who ate the same amount of calories, only when in the day they ate it. People who overconsume calories later in the day, they had a harder time maintaining a healthy weight, and also it has effects on sleep significantly. So if you eat within a few hours of sleeping, that's going to increase heart rate at night. It's going to lower HRV. It's going to increase recovery time. You're not going to feel as well rested. And then the worse your sleep quality is, the worst decision making you're making the next day. It changes everything from blood sugar regulation to the quality of our decisions. You have less willpower. Anybody who's had less than optimal sleep knows this. You start craving all the worst foods. So getting sleep right is very, very important. So taking all of this into account, what I typically like to do with clients and patients is we actually get them eating a healthy, consistent breakfast. And the key word there is healthy, consistent, and nutritious. A nutrient dense breakfast with a lot of healthy fats, micronutrients, fiber, protein. So Fruit Loops is just not going to cut it. If that's what you're having for breakfast, you might as well skip it. So more maybe the standard American breakfast of pancakes, waffles, Fruit Loops. No, get rid of those things. Those are treats that you can have every now and then. But when we think about something nutritious and savory, eggs with a bunch of vegetables could be a good choice. For instance, Ezekiel bread with avocado, some sort of protein, yogurt could be helpful for certain people. So there's a lot of different options, but being consistent with that actually modulates hunger later in the day. One way to think about this is none of our meals act in isolation, meaning what we eat earlier affects our hunger levels at the current level, obviously. So if you are skipping breakfast, you're likely to be way hungrier later in the day. Once again, that's a generalization, but that seems to be the case for most people. So we've had amazing success just telling people to have a healthy breakfast at a consistent time, have a healthy lunch, and then have a lighter dinner. So what I do typically is I like to, wake up, do physical activity. I'm not super active in the morning. I don't wake up and hit the gym going hard or anything, but I like to do some physical activity, wait a little while, and about around 8 or 8:30. That's when I like to have my consistent, healthy breakfast. And then same thing with lunch. I try and have it at a consistent time, and I have a lighter dinner typically. And that just makes life a lot easier. I do not have to rely on willpower anymore to regulate calories. And I've done a lot of tests. I've tested on myself with body composition scans. I've tested on clients with body composition scans. And yes, some people do good, or they're okay. If you have no problems with energy levels, if you have no problems with maintaining a healthy body weight and you're skipping breakfast, I'm not going to tell you to start eating breakfast. This is for people who have a hard time with those things, who have a hard time regulating what they're eating throughout the day, who have a hard time with energy, who have a hard time making choices, healthy choices. For them, having a healthy breakfast typically makes sense. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is creating a system. You need to create a system because if you do not create a system, what you're up against is literally the smartest people on this planet who will want to get you hooked to all their food. I have people who come to me all the time, people who are overweight, who are struggling with weight and energy, and they always feel bad and guilty, and they think, oh, I don't have willpower to do this, or they just feel that they're just filled with guilt because they think it's a willpower problem. This is not a willpower problem, okay? The forces, what people are up against, are massive. They're very, very difficult. So we need to rely on creating internal systems that regulate it, and then you don't have to use willpower. This is just the way you are. And there's very specific strategies you could do to optimize for that. But that's why I keep on saying the word consistent, because it's so important to do that. If you just leave it up to your whims when to eat, that's when things go wrong. And that's one of the problems that intermittent fasting has solved, right? We're just not saying we could eat whenever we want in this food abundant society. We're putting constraints on it. So main takeaways here: have a restricted eating window. 11 to 10 hours of eating seems to be good. You do not want to be eating throughout that window. You want to have breaks in between. Ideally, around 3 meals a day seems to be ideal. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to prioritize real whole food as opposed to processed foods, satiety self-regulates, meaning your hunger levels and everything else slowly starts to self-regulate, and you do not have to expend enormous amounts of willpower. So that is the major takeaway here. And the reason this is so important is because there's a lot of conflicting information out there. So this is the number one question I typically get, is my opinion on intermittent fasting. And there's a lot of celebrities who've done this. Chris Pratt I think he was in a GQ article saying he just skips breakfast, and so there's a lot of people out there who say that this can work, and it can work for a short period of time, but what I'm thinking about is long-term sustainable changes for the rest of your life. That requires a different philosophy, a different paradigm. And for them, for the people who do this right, typically eating a healthy breakfast seems to work, but there's individual variation. That's why I think it is helpful to work with people often. And by the way, there's a lot more information like this to come. I will be talking about this topic in a lot more detail because there are going to be circumstances where this might not be the case. So if you're interested in these type of topics, subscribe to this channel. There'll be a ton of content coming soon, and I hope you found that helpful.